Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. In a quiet UK town, people vanished one by one, leaving behind nothing but fear. Families searched, police struggled, and rumors spread. For years, the truth stayed buried. But hidden in an attic, a box of old cassette tapes held the answers no one expected. On those tapes was the voice of the killer himself, calm, cold, and confessing everything. These tapes would shock the nation and expose the monster who lived among them. This is the chilling story of the hidden confessions of a UK serial killer, the tapes they never wanted you to hear. The town of Ashford was the kind of place people rarely noticed. It was small, quiet, and safe, or at least it seemed to be. Families lived in rows of brick houses. Children played in the streets, and the sound of church bells filled the air. On Sundays, most people believed nothing bad could ever happen there. But that belief would one day be destroyed when the truth about a hidden killer came to light. It began with disappearances. At first, they were easy to explain away. A young woman who had been fighting with her family didn't come home. People said maybe she ran away to the city. A man who had lost his job vanished one evening, and neighbors whispered that he might have gone somewhere new for work. Each case seemed sad, but not alarming. Life in Ashford carried on as usual, but as the months passed, the stories added up. Posters of missing faces began to appear on lampposts. Families begged for answers. Police opened investigations but struggled to find evidence. The victims had nothing in common. Some were young, some older. Some were men, some women. They came from different backgrounds. The only thing they shared was the town itself. Behind closed doors, people whispered about a curse. Some said maybe it was gangs. Others believed in human trafficking. Nobody dared say the darker thought that crossed their minds, that someone among them might be responsible. One man watched these fears quietly. His name was Martin Graves. He lived alone in a narrow house at the edge of town. He was polite to neighbors, quiet, and unremarkable. People barely noticed him. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and never caused trouble. Yet behind his calm face was a hunger he could not control. Martin had learned how to hide his darkness. He dressed neatly, spoke politely, and smiled when people greeted him. But inside, he thought differently. To him, life was a game of power. He believed people were easy to fool, easy to control, and he enjoyed watching them trust him while never knowing the truth. Years earlier, Martin had started recording himself. At first, the tapes were nothing unusual. He spoke about his day, his frustrations, his secrets. But slowly, they changed. His voice grew colder, the subjects darker. He confessed things into the recorder that no one else knew. When the disappearances in Ashford began, the tapes became even more disturbing. He described the way he chose people, how he watched them, and how he ended their lives. He spoke not with regret, but with pride. The police had no idea about the tapes. They were locked away in Martin's house, hidden in a box under loose floorboards in the attic. To the world outside, he was just another man living a quiet life. But in those tapes, he revealed the truth about who he really was. A serial killer who had taken more lives than anyone could guess. As the disappearances grew, Detective Hannah Cole was assigned to the case. She was young but sharp, with a determination that impressed even her older colleagues. She didn't believe in easy answers. She didn't believe all the missing people had simply left town on their own. She felt something darker was happening. Hannah spent hours reviewing files. She marked the dates and locations of each disappearance on a map. Slowly, a pattern began to appear. Most of the missing were last seen within a few miles of Ashford's train station. That area was quiet at night, with broken streetlights and few cameras. It was the perfect hunting ground, but a pattern was not proof. The families of the missing grew more desperate, and the town more restless. Police officers knocked on doors, searched abandoned buildings, and questioned anyone who seemed suspicious. Still, no clear suspect emerged. Martin continued to play his role well. When officers visited his street, he greeted them politely and offered tea. He answered their questions calmly and even signed up to help in one of the volunteer search groups. People looked at him and saw nothing but a quiet, lonely man. Nobody asked where he was on the nights people vanished. Nobody guessed that the very person handing out flyers was the one who had caused the pain. On one tape, Martin laughed as he described how easy it was. "They look right past me," he said. "The police, the neighbors, everyone. They talk about monsters, but they don't see me standing right there. That's the best part, hiding in plain sight." Detective Cole began to notice something odd. During community meetings, she observed how Martin always sat near the back, watching but never speaking much. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything, but something about his quiet presence stuck in her mind. He was always there, always close, but never drawing attention. Meanwhile, Martin kept recording. Each time he pressed the button on his old tape recorder, he felt a rush of excitement. He confessed things no one else would ever hear. At least, that was what he thought. His voice described the sound of footsteps in the dark, the look in someone's eyes before they vanished, the silence afterward. He spoke of control, of power, of the secret thrill that no one could take away from him. But secrets rarely stay hidden forever. One winter evening, heavy rain flooded parts of Ashford. Water seeped into old houses, damaging floors and walls. At Martin's home, the storm loosened the attic boards. One of the boxes shifted, and several tapes rolled free. He didn't notice at first, too busy watching the news about the storm. But later, when he climbed the stairs to check the damage, he saw the tapes lying on the floor, water-stained, but still intact. He picked them up carefully, heart racing, and pushed them back into place. For the first time, he felt a trace of fear. If anyone ever found the tapes, his mask would be gone. Detective Cole, unaware of the tapes, kept digging. She requested phone records, checked CCTV footage, and interviewed families again. She was determined to find the truth, even if it meant searching every house in town, and while she worked late in her office, Martin pressed record once more. His voice, calm and steady, filled the tape. "They think they're getting closer," he said softly. "But they'll never find me, not unless I want them to. These tapes are my truth, and my truth is mine alone." He stopped recording, rewound the tape, and smiled to himself. But he was wrong. One day, those very tapes would be the key to his downfall. Detective Hannah Cole sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of case files. The rain outside tapped against the window as she stared at the board covered with photos of missing people. Claire Johnson, David Price, Emma Lewis, all different ages, different backgrounds, yet all gone without a trace. She circled their last known locations again, the red ink forming a web across the map. Each line she drew pulled her deeper into the belief that these were not isolated cases. Her colleagues were not all convinced. Some officers argued that Emma might have run away to London, while others believed David had taken his own life. But Hannah refused to accept those answers. Too many people were disappearing from the same place. Too many families were left without closure. Meanwhile, Martin Graves carried on with his ordinary life. By day, he walked to the corner shop, nodded politely at neighbors, and fixed small things around his house. By night, his darkness returned. He spent hours in his attic, replaying his tapes, listening to his own voice describe the terrible things he had done. The tapes had become his private diary, his confessional. Each word he spoke into the recorder was a reminder of the control he had, the secret he carried while the rest of the world remained blind. Martin had grown confident. The police had searched abandoned buildings, checked local CCTV, and questioned dozens of people, yet no one came close to him. He smiled to himself as he recorded late into the night. "They walk past me every day," he said softly into the microphone. "The detective, the neighbors, the families of those I've taken. They don't see me. They never will." But Hannah was watching more closely than he realized. She had started attending community meetings where families of the missing gathered. She noticed who came regularly, who stayed quiet, who offered help. And always, at the back of the room, was Martin. He never spoke much, only listened. His expression was calm, almost too calm, while others wept or demanded answers. One evening after a meeting, Hannah mentioned him casually to a colleague. "That man in the back, Martin Graves. What do we know about him?" Her colleague shrugged. "Not much. Lives alone, odd jobs here and there, no criminal record. Keeps to himself." It wasn't enough to raise alarm, but Hannah's instincts told her to keep him in mind. As weeks passed, the pressure grew. Families appeared on television begging for information. "Please, if anyone knows anything about Emma, come forward," her mother cried during a broadcast. The whole town felt the weight of fear. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone. People locked doors earlier. Rumors spread that the police were hiding something, that maybe the missing were already dead. Martin, however, thrived on the panic. He enjoyed the whispers, the way people jumped at shadows. In his tapes, he mocked the community. "They fear a monster," he said, his voice low and steady. "But the monster shops in the same store, walks the same streets. They greet me every morning, and still they have no idea." His confidence made him bolder. One night, he followed a young man leaving a pub. The man walked unsteadily through the quiet streets, unaware of the footsteps behind him. Martin smiled, savoring the moment. But headlights appeared suddenly, and the man got into a friend's car. Martin retreated into the shadows, frustrated but excited. The thrill of hunting had become as addictive as the act itself. Detective Cole was growing restless. She needed something tangible, so she returned to each family asking questions again. One mother remembered something she had dismissed before. "Emma said once that a man kept watching her at the train station. She thought it was harmless, just a lonely man. But now, maybe it was something more." Hannah pressed for details, but the mother could only describe him as average-looking, quiet, with tired eyes. It wasn't much, but it made Hannah think again of Martin Graves. Average-looking, quiet, always there but never noticed. Still, suspicion was not evidence. Hannah decided to widen her search. She requested old reports from other nearby towns. Late at night, she read through them, her eyes growing heavy. Then she noticed something strange. 2 years earlier, in a town 20 miles away, there had been another cluster of disappearances. The victims were different, but the pattern was the same. People vanishing near train stations, with no trace left behind. The cases had gone. Cold, filed away and forgotten. Could it be the same person? Hannah wrote Martin's name on a fresh piece of paper and circled it. For the first time, she felt she had a real lead, but she knew she had to be careful. If she moved too quickly, she could lose him. Meanwhile, Martin grew careless. One evening, his neighbor knocked on the door, asking for help to move some furniture. Martin agreed politely, but when she stepped inside, she noticed a faint smell in the house. It was sharp, chemical, unlike anything she had smelled before. She didn't ask questions, but later she told her husband it made her uneasy. That same night, Martin recorded another tape. "I think they're starting to look closer," he whispered. "The detective stares at me longer now." But it doesn't matter. These tapes are mine. My truth will live here, even if they take me away. He placed the tape carefully back into the box. unaware that the very thing he loved most would one day expose him. Detective Cole didn't yet know about the tapes, but she was getting closer. She started discreetly watching Martin, noting his movements, his routines. He always walked alone, always carried the same old bag. Sometimes he disappeared for hours with no explanation. Her instincts told her she was on the right path. She just needed proof. The town of Ashford, once so quiet, now lived in constant fear. Families prayed for answers, police searched tirelessly, and Hannah Cole followed the faint trail of a man who blended into the background too well. And in his attic, Martin pressed record once again. His voice filled the room with calm, chilling certainty. "They think they're hunting me," he said, "but I'm the one hunting them." Detective Hannah Cole was certain now that Martin Graves was more than just a quiet man at the back of community meetings. Every instinct told her he was connected to the missing. But instincts weren't enough for a judge, and they weren't enough for the families begging for justice. She needed a mistake. She began watching him more closely. She had officers note when he left his house, where he went, and how long he stayed. He rarely went far. The grocery store, the corner shop, sometimes the pub, but there were long stretches at night where no one saw him at all. It was as if he vanished into the darkness, only to reappear the next morning as though nothing had happened. Martin noticed the extra eyes on him. At first, it amused him. He recorded on his tapes, laughing at how obvious the police thought they were. "They think they're clever," his voice said into the recorder. "Watching me, following me, but I'm cleverer. They'll never find what I hide." He spoke more freely on the tapes now. Each one became a confession, not of guilt, but of pride. He described his victims in chilling detail, their faces, their last words, the power he felt as he took away, their lives. He called the tapes his truth. To him, they were not shameful secrets, but trophies of his intelligence. What he didn't know was that his growing arrogance would be his undoing. One night, a man walking his dog near the edge of town noticed something strange. An old shed on a path behind the rail yard had a broken lock. He went closer, curious, and smelled something foul. Alarmed, he called the police. Officers arrived, and what they found inside shocked them. The shed contained scraps of clothing, stained and torn. In the corner, there were ropes, plastic sheets, and a rusted metal chair. Everything pointed to something sinister, but there was no clear link to any suspect. No fingerprints, no names, no photographs. Detective Cole visited the shed herself. She stood inside, her torch beam moving across the walls. She felt the weight of silence in that place, the cold air heavy with secrets. "This is where it happened," she whispered to herself. She could feel it. But again, suspicion was not proof. Still, she thought of Martin. The shed was only a 15-minute walk from his home, and he often disappeared at night. Could this have been his hiding place? While she investigated the shed, Martin recorded again. "I told them they'd never find me," he said into the microphone. "But they're looking in the right places now. They're getting closer. That makes the game even better." He laughed, softly rewound the tape, and tucked it back into the box under his attic floorboards. The collection had grown large now, dozens of tapes stacked neatly in order. Each one carried his voice, his stories, his secrets. But cracks began to show. One evening, a neighbor saw Martin late at night carrying heavy bags out of his car. She thought it was strange because the bags looked like they sagged with weight, not like groceries or tools. She told her husband, who dismissed it, but the image stayed in her mind. When the news about the shed came out, she called the police. Detective Cole listened carefully to the woman's story. It wasn't enough to arrest Martin, but it added another piece to the puzzle. Step by step, the picture was becoming clearer. Martin, however, grew restless. He didn't like the feeling of eyes on him. One night, as he walked home, he saw a car parked nearby. Inside, an officer pretended to read a newspaper. Martin smiled faintly and raised his hand in a mock wave. The officer looked away. Later, on his tape, Martin spoke about it. "They're outside now, sitting in their cars, watching me like I'm some animal in a cage. But they don't understand. I'm the one watching them." Detective Cole pressed harder. She ordered surveillance of Martin's home. Officers noted when lights turned on, when he left, when visitors came. He rarely had any. He lived alone, silent and secret. One night, a young constable noticed something unusual. Through a small gap in Martin's attic window, he saw a flicker of light. It looked like Martin was up there, talking to someone, but no one else was inside. The constable reported it to Cole, who grew more curious. What could he be doing alone in the attic at midnight? Martin was recording, of course, on that tape. His voice was calm but sharper than usual. "I think it's time to move them," he said. "The shed isn't safe anymore. They're too close. If they find the tapes, the game is over. But they won't. I'll make sure of it." That tape would later prove to be his greatest mistake. Meanwhile, Detective Cole's determination pushed her to request a search warrant. It wasn't easy. The judge reminded her that suspicion wasn't proof, but she argued that the pattern of disappearances, the shed, and Martin's unusual behavior were enough to take a closer look. Reluctantly, the warrant was signed. The following week, officers prepared to search Martin's house. But before they arrived, something unexpected happened. A storm hit Ashford again, worse than before. Heavy winds rattled rooftops, rain poured into the streets, and in Martin's attic, the boards shifted once more. Several tapes rolled loose and tumbled down the stairs. The next morning, while Martin was away, a plumber visited the house on a routine check arranged weeks earlier. Finding the door unlocked, he stepped inside and called out. No answer. As he moved through the house, he noticed the tapes scattered near the stairs. Curious, he picked one up and slipped it into his pocket. Later that day, at home, he placed the tape into an old cassette player. The voice that came through chilled him to the bone. It was Martin, speaking calmly about the night Emma Lewis disappeared. He described following her from the station, the fear in her voice, and the silence. That followed. The plumber froze. His hands shook as he stopped the tape. Without hesitation, he called the police. Detective Cole rushed to the station when she heard. She sat in silence as the tape played, her heart pounding. The voice was cold, steady, and clear. The truth was out at last. For the first time, she had real evidence. The monster hiding in plain sight had finally left his shadow. The tape played over and over in the small police station office. Detective Hannah Cole sat with her arms crossed, her eyes locked on the cassette player as Martin's calm voice filled the room again. His words were chilling, detailed, and impossible to ignore. "She tried to run," he said softly on the recording. "But I was faster. They always think they can get away." Every officer who heard it felt the same cold shiver. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't just suspicion or theory. Martin Graves was the man behind the disappearances. Hannah moved quickly. She requested a team to secure his house before he could destroy more evidence. Officers gathered outside the narrow brick home, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Inside, Martin sat in his living room, sipping tea, the rain tapping on the windows. He looked calm, almost as though he expected them. When the knock came at his door, he didn't flinch. "Martin Graves," an officer called. "We have a warrant. Open the door." Martin set down his cup, rose slowly, and unlocked the door. His expression was flat, unreadable. "You've been waiting for this," he said quietly. "Come in." The officers moved past him quickly, spreading out through the house. Hannah led the way up the narrow stairs to the attic. She had imagined this moment for weeks, and now here it was. She pulled back the boards in the floor and found the box. Inside were rows of cassette tapes neatly labeled with dates. Her breath caught as she lifted one. The truth sat heavy in her hands. Dozens of tapes, maybe more. Each one holding Martin's voice, his confessions. She turned to the officers and said, "This is it." Downstairs, Martin sat calmly between two policemen. He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He simply watched as they carried the box past him. A small smile flickered on his lips. "So you found them," he murmured. At the station, the tapes were secured and reviewed. What they revealed was worse than anyone had expected. Martin had recorded everything. Each victim had a tape. On some, he described how he followed them. On others, he confessed to what he did after taking them. His voice was steady, almost proud, as if he were telling stories, not crimes. Detective Cole listened to as many as she could. Each word cut deeper, the horror of what he had done impossible to measure. The number of victims was far greater than they had believed. Martin wasn't tied to just the recent disappearances in Ashford. His tapes described crimes from years earlier in other towns, even in other counties. This was no small-town killer. This was a man who had moved from place to place, leaving behind a trail of destruction that no one had seen until now. The town of Ashford erupted with the news. Families of the missing gathered outside the station, demanding answers. Reporters crowded the streets, shouting questions at officers. Headlines appeared within hours. Serial killer confessions found in Ashford home. And the tapes they hid. Voices of the monster next door. People who once waved to Martin in the streets now stared at his picture on the front page in disbelief. "I saw him every week," one neighbor said to a reporter. "He even helped me fix my gate." How could we not have known? Meanwhile, Martin sat in an interrogation room, his hands folded, his eyes calm. Detective Cole entered carrying one of the tapes. She placed it on the table between them. "This is your voice?" she said firmly. Martin tilted his head. "Yes. You. Admit it." He leaned back in his chair. "Why deny what you already know? The tapes say it all." Hannah studied him. "Why record them? Why keep them?" Martin's lips curved into a faint smile, because stories die if they are not told. And I wanted my story to live. Even if no one listened while I was alive, the tapes would remain. His words made her stomach turn. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't sorry. He wanted to be remembered. Over the following weeks, investigators worked tirelessly. They cataloged every tape, transcribed Martin's words, and cross-referenced his confessions with missing person reports across the UK. The scale of his crimes was staggering. Some of the cases had been considered runaways, others unsolved, mysteries. Now they had a voice connecting them all. Families came to the station to hear pieces of the tapes, desperate for answers but horrified by what they heard. Mothers wept as Martin's voice described their children's last moments. Fathers clenched their fists, unable to believe they had lived so close to such evil. The trial preparations began almost immediately. Prosecutors knew the tapes were their strongest weapon. Martin had handed them his guilt in his own words, but the tapes also carried another weight, the weight of pain for every family who had to hear them. Detective Cole found herself haunted by his voice. At night, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear him speaking, calm and cold, describing fear and death as though they were everyday events. She had solved the case, but the price of listening was heavy. Martin didn't seem to care about the trial. In fact, he seemed to welcome it. To him, it was another stage, another chance for his story to be heard. He told his lawyers to argue little. "The truth is already out there," he said. "Why hide it?" But Hannah knew the truth. He didn't want justice. He wanted attention. The community of Ashford struggled to heal. People gathered for vigils, lighting candles for those they lost. Churches held services where families held hands and wept together. The once quiet town now carried scars that would never fade, and in his cell, Martin whispered into the air as if still recording, though no device was there. "They finally heard me," he said, "and they always will." The trial of Martin Graves became one of the most talked-about cases in the United Kingdom. News channels ran daily updates, papers printed every detail, and outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the man whose voice had revealed horrors no one could imagine. People held photos of their missing loved ones, candles, and signs that read, "Justice for the Forgotten." Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with silence. Families of victims filled the benches, sitting shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale with grief. Journalists scribbled notes as cameras clicked quietly, and in the center of it all sat Martin Graves. Dressed in a plain suit provided by the court, he looked calm, almost relaxed, as if this were nothing more than another story being told. The prosecution began with the tapes. The judge allowed a selection of them to be played as evidence. When the first tape echoed through the courtroom, a chill ran through everyone present. Martin's voice was steady and clear, describing how he followed Emma Lewis from the train station. He spoke about the sound of her footsteps, the moment she realized she was not alone, and how quickly it ended. His tone was calm, almost casual, as if he were talking about the weather. Emma's mother broke down in tears, her sobs filling the room until the judge called for a pause. Reporters noted the moment, writing that the reality of Martin's crimes hit harder when heard in his own voice. Martin sat quietly as the tape played, showing no emotion. Occasionally he looked toward the families, but his expression remained blank. It was as though he was proud that his words carried so much power, proud that even in court he could command the room without saying anything new. The prosecution moved through the evidence piece by piece. The tapes, the items found in the shed, the testimonies of neighbors who had seen strange things late at night. They built a picture of a man who lived quietly by day, but carried out monstrous acts in the shadows. Detective Hannah Cole took the stand. She spoke firmly, her voice steady. As she described the investigation, she explained how the disappearances had formed a pattern, how her instincts led her to Martin, and how the discovery of the tapes finally revealed the truth. The courtroom listened closely, her words carrying weight. She became the voice of the victims who could no longer speak for themselves. When it was the defense's turn, their arguments felt weak. They suggested the tapes were fantasies, that Martin had exaggerated or invented stories for attention. But the evidence was too strong. The tapes matched dates, times, and details that only the killer could know. Items found in the shed connected directly to the victims. The defense struggled to convince the jury while Martin sat quietly, never denying what he had done. Reporters outside the courthouse reported every word. Newspapers printed headlines like "Voices from the Dead, the Trial of Martin Graves," and "The Tapes They Tried to Hide." The UK public followed the case daily, shocked not just by the crimes, but by the idea that a man like Martin had lived among ordinary people, unnoticed, for so long. During one court session, another tape was played. This one described David Price. Martin's voice spoke about how David was strong, how he tried to fight back, and how Martin felt the thrill of overcoming him. The words were cold, cruel, and without mercy. David's father sat in the courtroom, his fists clenched, his face red with anger. He had to be restrained when he tried to stand and shout at Martin. Through it all, Martin remained calm. Some jurors glanced at him nervously, disturbed by his composure. It was as if he enjoyed being at the center of the storm, as if the trial was just another stage for his story. Detective Cole noticed it too. From her seat, she watched him carefully. He was proud, she realized. He didn't care about punishment. What mattered to him was that people were finally listening. The trial stretched on for weeks. More tapes were played, each one darker than the last. Families listened with broken hearts, many leaving the courtroom in tears. The prosecution called psychologists who explained that Martin's recordings were not fantasies, but confessions. He had documented his crimes to relive them, to preserve them. As the trial neared its end, the prosecution gave their closing statement. "This man did not simply commit crimes," the lawyer said firmly. "He documented them with pride. He wanted the world to know what he had done. And now, because of these tapes, we do know. It is our duty to make sure he never walks free again." The defense spoke briefly, repeating that the tapes could not prove every detail, but their words carried little weight. The jury had heard too much. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the tension was unbearable. Families held hands, waiting for justice. Reporters rushed outside to broadcast live updates. The entire nation seemed to pause. Martin sat back in his chair, calm as ever. To him, the outcome was irrelevant. Guilty or not, his story had been told, his tapes had been heard. He had left his mark. In the quiet of her office that evening, Detective Cole stared at the photos of the victims one last time. She thought of the families, of the tears in court, of the horror in Martin's voice. She hoped the jury would bring the justice they deserved, but she also knew nothing could erase the pain. The people of Ashford and towns far beyond would never forget. They would always remember the quiet man who sat at the back of meetings, who smiled politely at neighbors, who carried death in his shadow. And they would remember the tapes, the haunting voice that confessed to everything, the voice that could never be silenced. The jury had their decision to make, and the world waited. The jury sat in silence for 2 long days. Families of the victims gathered outside the courthouse, holding photos, praying, and waiting for justice. Reporters stood in the rain with cameras pointed at the entrance, ready to capture the moment. The verdict was read. Across the country, people tuned in, the trial dominating every headline. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick. Detective Hannah Cole sat at the front, her eyes fixed on the door through which the jury would return. She had lived this case for years now, carrying the weight of every missing person, every unanswered question. This was the moment she had worked toward, yet her chest felt heavy with nerves. Martin Graves sat at the defense table, calm as always. He wore the same faint smile, his hands folded neatly, his eyes scanning the room as if he were still in control. Even as the guards shifted beside him, ready for whatever might happen, Martin looked like a man enjoying the attention. Finally, the jury entered. They carried a folded piece of paper, the verdict written inside. The judge called the court to order, and everyone rose as the foreman stood. The air felt frozen. On the charge of the murder of Emma Lewis, guilty. On the charge of the murder of David Price, guilty. On the charge of the murder of Claire Johnson, guilty. On the charge of multiple counts of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, guilty. Each word echoed through the courtroom like a strike of thunder. Families cried out, some sobbing, some whispering prayers of thanks, others clenching their fists with relief. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. Martin didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised or angry. He sat still, expressionless, as though the verdict meant nothing to him. Only when the last word was spoken did he tilt his head slightly and smile faintly, as if satisfied that his story had reached its final chapter. The judge set sentencing for the following week. The court emptied slowly, families clinging to one. Another, some crying, some silent. Outside, the crowd erupted with shouts, chants of justice, and flashing cameras. The nation finally had an answer. The man who hid behind tapes and shadows would never be free again. Over the next few days, newspapers printed his face on every front page. Headlines read, "Guilty, the voice of a monster," and "The tapes." That sentenced him. Television shows debated his motives, psychologists analyzed his behavior, and families prepared themselves for the next stage, the sentencing. When the day came, the courtroom was fuller than ever. Families of victims filled the benches, determined to be heard. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence, life in prison without parole. The defense offered little resistance, knowing there was no chance of freedom, but the sentencing hearing gave the families something they had not had before, a chance to speak. One by one, mothers, fathers, and siblings stood before the court and addressed Martin directly. Emma's mother, her hands shaking as she held a photo of her daughter, said, "You took her from us, but you will never take away her memory. Every time I hear your voice on those tapes, I remind myself that you will die behind bars. That is my justice." David's father, his voice hard with anger, leaned forward and said, "You thought you were clever. You thought you would never be caught. But you were. And now the world knows what you are. A coward hiding behind a recorder." Claire's brother, younger but full of fire, said, "You wanted your story to be remembered. But what people will remember is not your power. They will remember the faces of the people you hurt. They will remember the families you broke. You are nothing but a shadow that will fade in time." Martin listened to each statement without a word. Sometimes he blinked slowly. Sometimes his lips curled faintly into the smallest of smiles, but he never spoke back. Finally, the judge gave the sentence. Martin Graves was ordered to serve life in prison with no possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind walls, his story contained, his tapes locked away as evidence. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs and whispers. Families hugged one another, tears of relief falling freely. Detective Cole let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was done. The case that had haunted her for years had reached its end. As guards led Martin away, reporters shouted questions. "Do you regret it? Do you have anything to say to the families?" He ignored them all. But just before he stepped through the door, he turned slightly toward the courtroom. His lips curved into that faint smile once more. The same smile he had worn since the beginning. It was not the smile of a man broken, but of a man who believed he had won in some way. That night, vigils were held across Ashford. Candles lit the streets, photos of victims lined the church steps, and people prayed together for peace. For the first time in years, the town felt a little lighter, even if scars remained. Detective Cole walked home late, the cool air on her face. She thought of the tapes, of Martin's cold voice describing things she wished she could forget. She thought of the families who would never see their loved ones again. Justice had been served, but nothing could erase the pain. In his prison cell, Martin sat on the narrow bed. The walls were bare, the lights harsh. He had no tapes, no recorder, no way to leave his mark anymore. Yet in his mind, his voice continued. He whispered into the silence, as if someone could still hear him. "They know me now," he said softly, "and they always will." Martin Graves began his life sentence in Belmarsh Prison, a place reserved for some of the most dangerous criminals in the UK. The gray walls, the cold halls, the locked doors. This was his world now. Guards watched him closely. Inmates whispered his name, and everyone knew who he was. The man who had recorded his crimes. The man whose tapes shocked the nation. To many prisoners, he was not feared, but despised. Some called him the tape man, mocking the very thing that had exposed him. Others avoided him altogether, unwilling to share space with someone who showed no remorse. Martin, however, walked through the prison with the same calm he carried in court. He had always hidden in plain sight, and here was no different. But the truth was that life in prison was nothing like the life he once lived. No attic to hide his secrets, no tape recorder to whisper into. Just silence, interrupted by the noise of doors slamming and guards shouting orders. For the first time in years, Martin had no way to control the story. He was no longer the narrator. He was just another inmate with a number. Outside the prison, the case continued to echo. Documentaries were filmed, podcasts dissected every detail, and newspapers printed long features about the hidden tapes. Families of the victims gave interviews, speaking about the pain of hearing their loved ones' final moments. Some said the tapes had given them answers they never thought they would have. Others admitted they wished the tapes had never been found, because the sound of Martin's voice was too much to bear. Detective Hannah Cole tried to move forward. She was promoted for her work, praised for following her instincts when others doubted her. But in quiet moments, she still thought of the tapes. At night, she sometimes dreamed of Martin's voice, calm and steady, confessing in the dark. She knew the case had changed her forever. The people of Ashford struggled too. The small town that once felt safe now carried scars. The streets where children once played were marked by fear. Neighbors still whispered about how Martin had lived among them, unnoticed. "He was at the back of every meeting," one woman said. "He smiled, he nodded, and all the while, he was hiding the truth." The thought haunted them, that evil could live so close without being seen. Years passed, but Martin's tapes never lost their power. Investigators continued to review them, linking his words to other unsolved disappearances. More families came forward, realizing their missing loved ones might have been among his victims. The number of lives he had taken remained uncertain, but it was clear that it was far more than anyone first believed. In prison, Martin aged. His hair grew gray, his face lined with wrinkles, but his eyes remained sharp. He rarely spoke to other inmates. Sometimes he sat alone in the yard, staring at the sky as if remembering the freedom he once had. Guards said he often whispered to himself, as if still recording in his mind. One officer recalled passing his cell late one night and hearing Martin mutter, "They're still listening." When asked what he meant, Martin only smiled. His tapes were stored in evidence, locked away and preserved. Police training academies used them to teach new detectives about criminal psychology. Students sat in silence as Martin's calm voice described his crimes. Some had to leave the room, unable to listen. Others forced themselves to hear every word, determined to understand how a man could hide so much behind such a quiet mask. For the families, the tapes remained a curse and a comfort. A mother said, "I hate that his voice is the last thing my daughter heard, but at least I know what happened. At least I don't have to wonder anymore." A father admitted he kept a copy of the transcript folded in his wallet so he would never forget why he fought for justice. Detective Cole visited one of the families years later. She sat with Emma's mother in a small kitchen, the kettle steaming between them. "Do you ever stop hearing him?" the mother asked. Cole shook her head. "No," she said softly, "but I remind myself that he can't hurt anyone anymore." Martin never admitted regret. In rare interviews, he spoke in the same calm tone, never apologizing, never showing sorrow. "I told the truth," he said once. "That's all I ever wanted." His words sickened many, but they also revealed what drove him. The tapes were not accidents. They were his way of leaving a mark, of ensuring his story would outlive him, and in a way, it did. Long after the trial ended, long after the crowds left the courthouse, long after Martin disappeared into prison walls, the tapes remained. Each one a frozen piece of his mind, a record of the darkness that lived behind an ordinary face. When Martin finally died in prison years later, the news spread quickly. Some families felt relief, others only emptiness. The prison released a short statement, confirming his death of natural causes. But even in death, his presence lingered. News reports replayed clips of his tapes, reminding the public of the voice that once haunted the UK. Documentaries revisited the case, calling him one of Britain's most chilling killers. And in Ashford, people still lowered their voices when they passed his old house, now empty and abandoned, the attic boards nailed shut. Detective Cole stood at his grave one cold afternoon, long after the reporters had moved on. The marker was plain, just a name and a date. She thought of the families, the tapes, the years of work that had led to this. "You don't win," she whispered. "Your story doesn't win. The families do. They lived through it, and they're still here." She turned and walked away, leaving the grave behind. The legacy of Martin Graves was not just the lives he took or the tapes he recorded. It was the reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, behind ordinary faces and polite smiles. It was the warning that silence can be dangerous, that paying attention can save lives. The tapes he hid were his confessions, but in the end, they became something else. The proof that brought him down, the evidence that gave families answers, and the voice that ensured he would never be forgotten. Not as a man to admire, but as a monster history would remember. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.